People start looking at it as, well, they're just keeping their ideas to themselves because they're trying to whatever, fill in the blank, or they just choose to be lazy. It's easier to blame the person that is suffering than to try to understand what caused that to happen. And there's always a reason, right? Behavior is language, behavior is communication. So if someone's behavior has changed, something to be investigated.
Hello and welcome to episode 111 of the Living and Leading with Emotional Intelligence podcast. I'm your host, Brittney-Nichole. Before I introduce our guest for today, I want to make a quick announcement. Some of you may have heard from previous episodes that this podcast will be switching over to Emotional Intelligence Magazine podcast, or EIM Plus. Now, I haven't established an exact date for that yet, but I just want you to be aware that this will likely be the last interview under the title of Living and Leading with Emotional Intelligence. Again, this podcast is going nowhere. It's just changing names. That said, I'm going to be taking a short hiatus to prepare the lineup of guest hosts that will be coming onto the podcast. I will still be doing once a month interviews per usual, but we're going to be adding some amazing people and allowing them to take the stage as the host. So there will be a few weeks where there will not be any new podcast as we're transitioning. That'll give you time, if you're a new listener, to go back and listen to some other episodes. Or if you're an existing listener, you've been here for a while, go back and listen to some of your favorite episodes, because all of those episodes, all 111, will be transitioning off the platform once we switch over. You'll still be able to find them on YouTube for a little bit until we take those down, and they will be archived. We will add them to a package for our Patreon supporters for Emotional Intelligence Magazine Plus. Okay, with that said, let's get to our guest for today, Crystal Morris. Crystal Morris is the founder and CEO of One Caring Adult. She has a master's in counseling studies, is a certified emotional intelligence, professional diversity, and trauma and resilience coach and trainer. As a culture and climate architect, she educates school districts, police departments, and private organizations on strategies to transform trauma to resilience by fostering meaningful relationships and culturally responsive spaces. The vision of One Caring Adult is to see a dismantled school-to-prison pipeline. Through the lens of a student and lifelong learner, Crystal uses her training as a mental health counselor, educator, and emotional intelligence coach to empower individuals and organizations to move from stuck to action, to adopt a paradigm shift. Crystal is a proud Jamaican American who celebrates everything that represents her cultural roots. To relax, she loves traveling, meeting new and interesting people, and curling up on the couch with her children and adorable fur baby, Dash. Without further ado, here is a wonderful guest. I look forward to introducing you to her, Crystal Morris. All right, Crystal, welcome to the Living and Leading with Emotional Intelligence podcast. It is a pleasure to have you. If you wouldn't mind, introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers in your own way.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Brittney-Nichole. I appreciate the welcome. If I had to introduce myself, I am a mom, evidenced by the mom life that is chewed up. This is perfectly explaining my life. I'm the mom of 3 beautiful kids, 1 neurotypical and 2 neurodivergent on the Autism Spectrum. And because of them, I am now the CEO and founder of One Caring Adult, where the vision of my business is to dismantle the school to prison pipeline by building people's emotional intelligence. So a quick snapshot of all of that in there.
Yeah. So for those who may not know what that spectrum is, can you elaborate a little bit more about that?
Sure. My boys have autism. So they have a different way of seeing the world. They look through a different lens. They are fully capable of doing everything a neurotypical child without a developmental delay can possibly do. They just do it differently. So it calls on me as mom and as the adults in their life to realize that art sometimes look like coloring outside of the lines, and it's still beautiful and it's still perfect and it's still intentional. So they do all the same things. They just do it differently.
Yeah. When I was a teacher for a while, I had several kids on the spectrum in my class, and it's amazing how creative they are because they have this intense focus on something. There's like a brilliance to it, right?
There is. I like to consider my children creators, not creative. Because if I look at it as creative, we tend to dismiss the cutesy, artsy, craftsy stuff. But when we see it through a lens that they are actually creating something and it's just completely different than you've created it in the past, you stop and you take a second look. You become super curious. You want to understand. You want to amplify. So I have 3 little creators in my back room somewhere that will probably make a featured appearance, but we'll see how long this lasts.
Yeah. Yeah. I think all of us could use that focus that I feel like a lot of people have on the spectrum of autism, because we're always so scatterbrained, and they seem to have this very intense focus on whatever they're doing. They're in the moment. And I think it's beautiful. So you kind of already started out by talking a little bit about what you do, why you started your business. But if you wouldn't mind kind of elaborating on that and how that ties into emotional intelligence specifically.
Sure. I was a teacher before I became a counselor. Then I went back to supporting teachers through professional development. But in all of the hats that I've ever worn, what I realize is that people treat children, it's that same mentality. We want to see you, but we don't want to hear you. And we don't value, we don't prize all of the goodness that's just wrapped up in every single one of them, especially ones that display behaviors that we deem as inappropriate, challenging, what have you. But when we start looking at behavior as language, all behavior is communication. All behavior is a clue to something that should be investigated and then channeled in a more socially appropriate way, right? So that, especially after raising my 2 boys, caused me to see opportunities that exist to support people to see through that lens, to adopt that mindset shift. And as I began doing the work, I realized it's not because people don't want to, they don't want to listen, they don't want to be curious. A lot of it is they come to the space not regulated themselves and not having emotional intelligence to understand what their thoughts and feelings are. A dysregulated adult will never be able to regulate a dysregulated child. So I produce a space that allows educators, adults in general, to understand what's happening inside and then be able to project a healthier way of doing, a way of being, a way of living, so that children then can mirror that and model it and then do it themselves. Yeah. So for me, emotional intelligence is equity. We have this buzz right now about DEI and equity and creating inclusive spaces. All of it for me starts with emotional intelligence.
Well said. And I really like how you said you cannot teach a child how to self-regulate if you, the adult, do not know or have that ability to regulate yourself.
Funny how it works, right?
It's so true. It's kind of that monkey see, monkey do mentality, right? We can tell people all day long what they should do. We're great at giving advice, but we often don't mirror that in our own behavior. And people are going to do what they see us doing. Yeah, and I think it's so important, like you said, especially for teachers. Teachers are given teachers are just loaded with things on their plate. And I could not imagine being a teacher during the pandemic. Yeah. It was hard enough before, and then it's compounded. They need that support. They need that emotional support. And so many teachers, I find, are projecting their stress out onto either parents or students. And I'm not saying all teachers, right? But you see a lot where these teachers are just so overwhelmed. They don't know how to handle all these emotions that they're feeling. And so it's unfortunately being projected onto the children, which is then probably reciprocated back to the teacher. And there's this toxic feedback loop. And it's not saying that they're bad people. I hate when people label it as, well, you're just a terrible person. No, you're someone who doesn't know how to regulate, likely at no fault of your own, because we've never been taught.
Yep.
It doesn't come with age, what a lot of people like to label as maturity. There's physical maturity, there's emotional maturity, there's mental maturity, intellectual maturity. But the emotional maturity is very rarely fostered in our systems.
See, that's a beautiful point you just raised, because if you look back at your life, if I look back at mine, at no point can I recall my parents ever sitting me down and saying, this is stress, and this is how you manage stress, and this is how you repurpose stress to build something better that will mitigate the stress. I didn't get that lesson. My parents skipped that phase. My teachers skipped that phase. My mentors, no one did it, because quite likely no one did it for them.
Right.
So at some point we disrupt this toxic feedback loop that you just referenced, and we have to start producing and teaching it, not just in the schools. That should be a great place to introduce it, because we have these young, malleable minds. Neuroplasticity is really in high effect, where their brains are growing and sponges even past age 8, when we know that a lot of those concrete things are taught. But doing this in the workplace as well. I did a leadership. I do a lot of work in schools, but I also support law enforcement. I support businesses to walk this walk of cultural humility through the lens of emotional intelligence. And I was working with a leader, and their thing to me was, well, I don't hire people that I need to train. I hire experts who know how to do this work already. And my feedback for that was, they were an expert where they're coming from, but coming into your culture, they are brand new. They have to be trained, and all of this has to be modeled for them.
Yeah.
But a lot of times our leaders are so emotionally intelligently bankrupt. I don't know if that was grammatically correct, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But there is this illiteracy that exists when it comes to emotional intelligence, that we end up creating corporate trauma, not realizing that the thoughts and attitudes that we have, that we think work for us to keep us motivated and driven, are toxic to those that we serve. And we see this constant attrition rate, this constant disengaged employee. Forbes put out an article, I think it was last year, that said $450 to $500 billion are drained from the US economy every year because of disengaged workers.
Yeah.
Those workers aren't disengaged because they're not passionate. They're super passionate. They're super committed to what the goals and the mission and the vision is. What they're not attaching and they're not connecting to is the leadership that creates that toxic environment, that corporate trauma. So everyone stands to learn and to benefit how to do this personally, and then how to model it so that those around them on their team, they have the ability to access positive and healthy emotional intelligence and regulation.
Yeah. And I do agree with you. I do think that the majority of people are passionate about what they do. There are some that probably aren't so passionate because they got into it because mom or dad pushed them into that field. So I think it's
always a mix,
right? There's a mix, but I do believe, as you said, that leadership plays a significant role, because when I worked for Wells Fargo before I left and started my business full time.
You're just going to call out names. Okay.
No, but actually, no. And I would never call out a name if I, we're going to speak negatively. I actually had a great experience while I was at Wells Fargo. What I was doing was definitely not my passion. I was working in technology and operations, and I monitored all of the data that came in to create mail pieces like foreclosures and auto and all this stuff. It was not a glamorous job. The job itself was not my passion, but the leadership that I was under was amazing. And so I came to work without stress, without anxiety. I got along with my peers and my team. They became, a second family to me. So like you said, you can, even if you don't necessarily love what you do, those people play a huge role in how you feel about what you do and how you do it.
Yeah, definitely.
100%. So thank you, my Wells Fargo team. See, I'm not bashing. There we go. But let's talk about, you mentioned trauma, like leadership trauma or causing trauma, the leaders. Okay. I really did a really poor job articulating that, but you get where I'm going. What are some of those signs of that trauma that can be induced by poor leadership?
I think one of the key indicators, and I'm looking at my time working in organizations, whether as direct care or in administrative roles where I was a director, when the most passionate people on your team stop talking, they're normally quick to generate creative ideas that will transform the work that is being done, but also the impact that is felt by those you're doing it for. When those individuals stop talking, it's already too late, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that tends to happen. And people start looking at it as, well, they're just keeping their ideas to themselves because they're trying to whatever, fill in the blank, or they just choose to be lazy. It's easier to blame the person that is suffering than to try to understand what caused that to happen.
Yeah.
And there is always a reason, right? Behavior is language, behavior is communication. So if someone's behavior has changed, something to be investigated, especially when they were the most passionate person on your team. But the attitude shifts, right? The running in to do shifts, the running in to support shifts, the question shifts. And we just start seeing people just falling into the background, going with the flow, no longer seeking to exceed expectations, but barely meeting them. Those are the things we want to look for. But I think one of the key things that contributes to that is when those things are being shared and nothing happens. It's the very, I'll look into that. I'll get back to you. And then nothing ever happens. And that is one of the things I've found that organizations do all the time. Sometimes they're not even conscious, but we do these data mining sessions where we ask for feedback and we collect the feedback over and over, asking people to relive their trauma stories, and nothing ever shifts, nothing ever happens. But worse, there's no follow-up. So I've just poured out my heart and my soul to you. I've shared with you things that I didn't think I would share. I'm not comfortable even discussing. And you took that and you did nothing with it.
Yeah.
You're telling me to stay silent in that moment.
That is such a valid point. And I think it goes back to, you talked about people feeling like they have to keep their ideas to them, or other people say, well, you're not talking because you're keeping your ideas to yourself. And everything that you just talked about makes me think of our culture, the scripts that we have, the mindsets that we've been conditioned to believe that we need to be competitive. We are not working with people, we are working against people to get to the top. Yet we're told when we get into an organization, we need to collaborate. It goes against that. And authenticity, people want to appear to be these things. I want to appear to care about you and be empathetic and make you feel that your voice is heard. But like you said, that without action, people are going to see right through that. And now they're going to be less likely to trust you, less likely to engage, because they've given up. And that's like you said, that's a bad spot to be at. You articulated that so beautifully, Crystal. So how do you see this shifting? Because what I see working with leaders, and the ones that I work with really do care and want to shift. But those who say, come in and fix this problem for me as a means to an end, that is all they see it as, a means to an end. how do you help those leaders and those individuals see that there's more to it than just getting those results?
The first thing is understanding what the results are. We want those return on investments when we look at the dollar amount, but when we start prioritizing human capital, not just financial capital, that shift comes. You talked about everyone using those trending buzzwords, right? The empathy and team building. We know the SEO terms that will make you appear to be doing a work that you're not necessarily committed to doing. And when leaders realize that however you are right now in this minute is perfectly fine, you just need to be mindful of it. We were talking about autism earlier, and a gift that autistic children have, or children presenting with autism have, is they can be present in the moment and focus on nothing else.
Yeah.
And that's the trick with leadership. It's understanding where you are in this moment and owning it, not judging it as bad or good or indifferent, but judging it as this is where I am currently, but where do I want to go next year and the years after that? And what is the impact right now is having on my team versus 5 years from now? Mm-hmm. And making that concentrated effort of committing to action. The work is never external. The work is always internal first. But there is this real big thing of instant gratification. I need to fix now. I need to do something now. So no one spends time understanding where their role is. They just look at everyone else. So the example I gave earlier with you not sharing your ideas anymore. Well, how do we get her to start sharing her ideas versus what was I doing that caused her to not share her ideas? How do I get her to feel more friendly and more belonging? No, what was I doing to create a space where she didn't feel or he didn't feel like he belonged? The work has to be internal first, and that's the commitment that leadership has to make. Mm-hmm. I rarely believe we have sociopaths in our midst. For the most part, we're all good people. Now, how do we take that from declaring that we're good people to actioning that thing and showing up, doing good work, showing up, being good work? It's not, Nike lied to us when they say just do it, it's just be it. And if that is who you are at the core, it will shine through. You can't hold that back because that is who you are and that's your way of being. But it starts internal first. All of this extra stuff happening because we need to show the public, look at what we're doing. Look at our checklist. Everything is checked off. Yeah. Quantitatively, you are impressive. Qualitatively, you're morally bankrupt. There is some dissonance that needs to be resolved.
So much wisdom. This is a wonderful conversation. I am just like boiling inside with excitement because everything you're saying resonates with me and is so true. And I'm sure it's resonating with the people listening and watching. And it, everything you're saying, it ties back to that fake it till you make it.
Yes. Yeah.
That doesn't always apply to everything. It seems that we tend to generalize and do blanket statements and apply it to everything in our lives. When you're doing certain things, the fake it till you make it will work, right? But when you're dealing with people and those very sensitive issues and being, that is not something you want to fake till you make, because when something happens, when things are going great, now all is well. But when things aren't going great, things are going to come through the cracks and then people are going to be skeptical. And I think about, and you had mentioned it, you have vision and values and your mission on the wall. And it's like, these are our vision, or this is our vision. These are our values. But just because you define them as your vision and values doesn't mean they are. And it's like, I don't know about you, but I think about past relationships where you go into the relationship and you put your best foot forward. You start to act as the person you want to be in that relationship. But within a few months, sometimes less time than that,
the representative goes to sleep in
the yeah, exactly. and your true self and their true self comes through and you're like, you're not the person that I fell in love with. You're not, because that wasn't who they were. That was who they wanted to be. And instead of, like you said, being honest and authentic, saying, I'm not perfect, I have flaws, this is the direction I'm going, but please give me grace as I get there and give me feedback so I can get there. Right?
There are two schools of thought. You have cultural competency versus cultural humility. And cultural competency is that checklist. This is what I know you want to see, so I will do it. And that's where the quantitative data shows up. We've done our 3 workshops for the year. We've done the 2 picnics. We've given out the gift cards. All of those big objectives have been met, so we can demonstrate cultural competence. Cultural humility, on the other hand, the one that I tend to lean towards, is exactly what you just described. You're going to mess this thing up every single day of the week, twice on Sundays, right?
Yeah.
I know you're good. I know your intentions are pure. How can you own that you've messed up and then do something different? Committing to action. Again, everything comes back to that commitment to action. There is never going to be a person in the world, ethnicity, gender, whatever, sexual orientation, all of it tossed out the window, that will get every interaction with another person right every single time.
Right.
And with that being said, how do we operate in a space? How do we create environments where people can unpack their authenticity? Because no place, especially when I look at people from what would be considered marginalized groups, whether it's race, sexual orientation, religion, gender, whatever it is, that people can show up truly in their authentic space because it wasn't created for them.
Yeah.
So as leaders, how do we build spaces where everyone gets to come in completely transparent and safe? It will never happen year 1. It will never happen year 2, but it can be something that we gradually grow into when we show each other that grace of, I trust that was not what you intended to say.
Yeah.
Help me understand what you were trying to say, and let's partner on co-creating something that is not going to harm me. That's how we start seeing the emotional intelligence of individuals growing, compassion and empathy growing. They jump off the pages and they start dancing in our hallways when we engage and commit to action. And that first step in action is showing grace.
Yeah.
Does this apply for everyone? Probably not, because some people really don't believe in being compassionate and empathetic, and they have some real dogmatic belief systems that won't shift. But again, those are few and far in between. The people that we interact with, the people that we have on our social media, the people who we look at pictures in the office and look at, oh my gosh, your baby has grown so much. For the most part, at the core of those individuals are good people. But if you've never been exposed to many of the things that are now popping up on all of our platforms, for a lot of people, change is hard, but they didn't even know change was needed and warranted. But when we grow in this commitment of grace, expanding our horizons, understanding emotional intelligence and leading from that, for me, emotional intelligence is the foundation. Yeah. No good leader should be emotionally bankrupt or not have that capacity.
Right.
But the reality is how many of them invest in it. So that's the shift that we can push, especially into 2022 and beyond. Yeah. That's the secret that organizations are missing. And that's why $450 to $500 billion is putting on their stilettos and shoes and marching out of businesses.
So I want to ask you this, because I feel like there's this tug of war, if you will, with a movement. People desperately want to be heard. They desperately want to be authentic, to have greater connection, to be that creator, to create with other people. Yet we still have a society that feeds us constant drama. I mean, you listen to the lyrics of most popular songs that are playing today, the behavior of these reality TV stars, the types of media and information we're consuming, whether it be on streaming networks, on YouTube, musicians, it tends to feed that put me first. I need to be seen above all else. It's not I'm great, so are they. It's I'm the greatest, and how can I prove that to the rest of the world? And there's also this, it seems to be feeding up, or we feed on other people's pain. Have you noticed that when someone else is down, sometimes we're like, see, I knew you screwed up. I knew that was going to happen. And then we broadcast it to the rest of the world. Mainly, I feel like because we are hurting ourselves. And so it's kind of feeling like, okay, we're not that bad if someone else messed up, but we don't see that. Instead, we project that insecurity onto other people. I feel like that's a major problem. Do you see that being a big challenge? Again, that tug of war where we're wanting to go in this direction, but we're being pulled at a very, I think, subconscious, unconscious level by corporations and media.
The purpose of businesses, the purpose of media is to sell and generate revenue. So they will put out a product that they know will sell and generate revenue. People stop buying, they'll switch, but people will always buy. So they will always produce, right? No business owner is going to put out a product that they know is going to sit on the shelf.
True.
So because of that, it makes sense to prime people to begin thinking along these lines so that you will always have them sucking at the teat and being addicted to whatever it is. We know that this is what you want. So we're gonna pump it into your system.
Why do you think we want it? Why do you think we want conflict and drama when we say we don't?
I think it goes back to that same thing we mentioned earlier. Who taught us to know different? Because the solution doesn't bring revenue, because the solution fixes the problem. We don't want to cure the disease. We want to treat it.
Yeah.
Because if I cure it, I have clients for a season. If I treat it, I have clients for a lifetime. So we buy into treatments. We buy into Band-Aids for gunshot wounds. We buy into this passive temporary instant solution that warms the soul and rots it. We just don't realize it's rotting until after. But in that moment, you're getting what you need, so you feel like your needs are being met. So you continue to subscribe. Who teaches people how to heal, and then from healing gets to that space where they now thrive? Our society is filled with, our society as in general, but I'm going to speak as a Black woman in this moment, we are taught to survive. We're not taught to live. We're not taught to thrive. We're taught to survive. And we are praised for being able to survive. Look how resilient she is. Yeah. You are so strong. And no one is looking at, well, what has caused pain and harm to exist for her to have to cultivate this strength, for him to become strong, and then by that becoming resilient. So that's the thing. I tend not to look at the behaviors of people, but being curious about what caused those behaviors to manifest in the first place. We teach resilience. Lord knows I have a whole program called Resilience Focused Programs. Because it's needed.
Yes.
But we have to, at some point in time, adopt this public health shift where we stop fishing people out of the water and fix the bridge that's broken. If we fix the bridge that's broken, we won't have muddy shoes and wet pants. But we've gotten so accustomed to doing hard, difficult, constant work, producing strong, resilient people that we don't realize it's possible to have them whole from the beginning.
So on that note, let's talk about the prison system. Because
everything today. Okay,
hey, it's
what's happening.
When you're having good conversation and it goes into the right direction, you're talking about feeding the beast, if you will. We see that, and I know you've worked in that space, which is why I'm bringing it up. But I feel like it's so unfortunate, especially with at-risk youth, they go in and there are some programs, and I'm ignorant to that system. But I feel like they're not necessarily doing the work that needs to be done. It's good work sometimes in these programs. But if you have like a line, right, of step one, step two, step three, they tend to be step two or three. And the thing that needs to be addressed first, like developing that emotional resilience, self awareness, isn't being implemented. Instead, it's like, well, let's teach them how to build a resume and have good work ethic and blah, 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 so that they can be a contributing adult in society and not feel like they need to do this criminal activity and behavior to get, but they're missing the biggest part of all, which is that piece of emotional intelligence. If they don't feel like they can be worthy of what society expects them to be, if they don't have their own self-worth, if they have childhood trauma, if they've, all of these emotional traumas are still going unaddressed, you can't be contributing. You can't find your passion in life if you don't have that self-worth and awareness. So if you wouldn't mind kind of speaking on that and how you see that being a major influence with this feedback loop in the system as well.
So I would go a little bit further back. Again, I look at the system, not necessarily the behavior. It's not incidental, it's episodic.
Mm-hmm.
So I was looking through some data when I was doing a workshop with school resource officers a few months ago, and I noticed how many students are arrested on campus or even off campus because of disorderly conduct. It is the number one reason for students. I look at them as scholars because it hits different when you hear you're a scholar. But I saw that the vast majority of them were arrested for disorderly conduct, and it directly correlated with Black African-American youth, mostly Black African-American, a lot after that were Hispanic. I'm Jamaican by birth. I was raised there. I moved here when I was 15, and a big part of who I am is a very loud person because we love big and loud. Everyone is going to know it. I'm raising an 11-year-old that is navigating how to not be like me and temper that down some because she is quite loud herself. But that is our passion, and that is our dedication, that is our commitment, that is our heart when you hear us that way. And especially when I talk with my accent, disorderly conduct is right up that alley. Mm. When we have people that are policing, that are supervising, that are in authority, and they don't understand the cultural lens of people and their lived experience, they will take the happiest moment of my life as something that should be subdued or arrested and put down.
Yeah.
So when we look at this system of at-risk, preferably at-hope children, that's something that we have to understand. Am I saying that youth that are involved in DJJ, the Department of Juvenile Justice, am I saying that all of them are completely without fault? Absolutely not. But I am cognizant of the fact that many of them that are entrenched in that system shouldn't be there. It was just a lack of understanding because of cultural differences. And there is not that desire by the adults to understand so that they can provide culturally responsive services.
Yeah.
You mentioned childhood trauma. The ACEs study, everyone knows adverse childhood, well, not everyone, but adverse childhood experience. It was something that was put forth by the CDC in partnership with Kaiser Permanente back in the 1995 to 2000 region. And they looked at 10 screeners of household abuse, community abuse, and just circumstances. And from those 10, 67% of the participants that they surveyed had at least one trauma exposure. They surveyed over 17,000 adults in California, the San Diego area. They were all pretty self-sufficient. They had insurance. They had majority, I think 80 some odd % of them had a bachelor's degree. These were people that were capable of maintaining their livelihood, yet 67% of them had childhood trauma, at least one.
Mm.
Now, if we look in the communities where our young people are going, or they're not matriculating from high school, they're matriculating into the Department of Juvenile Justice to then further on get their bachelor's and master's degrees, some of them their PhDs from the Department of Corrections. It's not 67% of those young people. It's closer to 100% of those young people with those childhood traumas. Mm-hmm. And then when we expand from that 10 to now looking at things that weren't considered, like poverty, like community violence, like racism and oppression, bias, the numbers grow. We are breeding criminals in under-resourced, marginalized communities. Because if one traumatic experience can cause someone to completely shut down from life, what about the child that has 5 and more, 10 and more? And the reality is those children exist and they go to school with the children with the silver and gold spoons in their mouths. And it's only a matter of time for it to where they come into alignment and connection. So when we sit in our ivy covered buildings and we say, that's not my child, I don't need to care. It's only a matter of time before those two children interact. So it is as much our problem as it is their problem. It is all of our problem. So again, the shifts have to happen, right? How do we stop looking at, well, this child is doing something bad, let me punish this behavior.
Yeah.
So this is a child that needs support. And with discipline and punishment are two different things, but they've become synonyms, and that is not okay. In my workshop with law enforcement officers, they had that aha moment of, we've been doing discipline wrong. Mm-hmm. Discipline is proactive before behaviors start manifesting to cultivate this sense of integrity and purpose and desire to want to do things good and whole, so that you benefit, but so that the other person apart from you, they benefit as well. Mm-hmm. Everyone stays safe. Punishment is what we lean on. And our criminal justice system shows us that punishment is ineffective because we see how high our recidivism rate is. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We can't punish away trauma. Punishment exacerbates trauma. Yes. And if we want to see where trauma lives, the P.O. box and mailing address for trauma is every single DJJ, every single state and city jail, every single federal pen. That is where trauma is housed. The most traumatized individuals in our society, they are incarcerated. And if we want to do the work of not treating but healing, we have to look at them as such. No one gets up in the morning saying, I want to be a criminal.
Exactly.
Let me do it. They weren't born that way.
Yeah.
But society and just our norms and the broken system that exists, that was in the breast milk that those children got. And that was in the food that strengthened their bones into adulthood, leading them to that lifestyle. Mm-hmm. So we just have some shifts that we need to make if we want to see some differences.
100%. And it's really hard for me sometimes to argue that to people that just, they're not there yet. They don't get it. And I get that they don't get it because I was that person that didn't get it. Yep. And until you come to that realization or you have an experience or epiphany on your own, nobody can hammer that into your head. You're going to believe what you're going to believe right?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say, for most people, it has to happen to you for it to matter to you. I was not an advocate. Well, I wasn't against it either, because that would make me a complete jerk. But I wasn't the person that was going to get up and go to an Autism Speaks walk.
Right.
But when the 9-year-old and the 7-year-old came home with the diagnosis, guess what? There's blue everywhere. My logo for One Caring Adult has a puzzle piece in there, and it's blue, and that was representative of both my boys. There's a man and a girl bringing the puzzle piece back to bring it to wholeness. That's my husband and my daughter. Mm. That is now entrenched in my life. I can't separate the two, but it had to happen to me to matter to me. Yeah. So do I think that people are colossal jerks when stuff like this doesn't really rock their boat? No. But I think when we can create awareness, especially when we can spotlight your core values, say, you believe in empathy, you believe in equality for all, you believe in equal access. Well, let me show you over here where all of what you just said is missing from this group.
Yeah.
And if you're open, I can explain the impact because it's missing. Then we start seeing people connect the dots. Because I know when I initially started doing my work when it comes to cultural humility and building culturally responsive spaces, I went into it very, not fire and brimstone like an evangelical preacher,
Yeah.
but fire and brimstone adjacent, where it was very history driven and all of this great content, but people weren't there yet because they didn't see themselves in the work. But now that it's focused on, I need you to be internally ready before you become externally facing,
Yeah.
light bulbs go off and shifts happen. And that's why I love our assessment tools that we use for emotional intelligence. It's broken down into these 15 subcomposites. And when I look at something like you score high in empathy, but you score low, I'm using high and low just for ease of reference. There's no bad score with this. But if you score a higher number for empathy and a lower number for social responsibility, that's a clue that there is some misalignment. There is not balance that exists. If you are empathetic, your social responsibility numbers should be in tandem. And if they're not, it's a great opportunity to explore so that you can learn about yourself. You can learn about the impact you project, and you can bring it into oneness. That's the power of emotional intelligence. It's not just this, kumbaya, feel good thing. It truly helps us to show up in the world as truly authentic to what we say, instead of just being that shiny on the outside, but rotten on the inside type.
Yeah. As I said earlier, I had this skewed mindset and I thought I was doing the right thing. I grew up in the South. I don't know if you call it deep South. But a lot of my family, they never traveled outside of their little bubble. They didn't even really go out of state much. So their views were very narrow-sided based on what they hear in the media, what they see here and there, but what they see is often filtered through the lens of what they're hearing. And so for me, discipline, if you're bad, go pick a switch outside, right? Spanking is good. It teaches you to not do that, and it makes you a fine adult, right? That was the way that they were raised. That was the way they disciplined me. There wasn't talk about why did you do that? What were you feeling when you did that? They didn't know any better. Nope. So when I decided I'm going to be a teacher, and I would see all these teachers talking about feelings, and this was before I got my degree, I'm like, that is so soft. They're raising these wimpy kids who are just spoiled and all this stuff. And it wasn't until
not holding them accountable.
And so once I started to get into early childhood education and understand, I'm like, oh my gosh, I was so wrong. But I was hell bent on, when I have children, their little asses are going to get beat when they're bad.
I did it for the first few years. When you know better, you do better, right? Because even back then, were you a horrible person? Were you Esther-isms? No, you were ignorant.
Exactly.
And ignorance is okay until you start getting information and you choose to remain ignorant. That's when we might have some issues, sis. But until then, if you don't know and you've never had an opportunity to engage in a meaningful way, because I can say, well, there's books out there. There's tons of books that I should be reading that I haven't read. This is why I only know this much Spanish. Like there are tons of things that we all have access to. But until something comes in that causes, and it doesn't necessarily have to happen because a man is on the floor saying, I can't breathe, or your child comes in with conversation. Sometimes you just get to a place where internally you're like, I want to grow in this area, and you can do it yourself. But until that moment hits, you'll remain in ignorance. So for me, and I'm not saying that this is everyone's work, but for me, I partner with people to co-create new understandings.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it is very scary, especially within organizations, for leaders to say, well, I don't know the right way to say it, so I just choose to not say it, and conformity bias kicks in. But when they have someone to partner with them in doing this work, partner with, not doing it for, but partner with them to do this work, all of a sudden, these walls start breaking down and real conversations happen where people get free to say, well, you never hold them accountable, because instead of punishing and firing them, all you say is, well, let's stay with this person and let's learn. And now leadership gets to explain, we're being developmental or deliberately developmentally appropriate. Like, this is what happens. This is how we train leaders, not train team members. When we see everyone at their potential instead of seeing them where they are, that shift happens. And for some people, they've never been seen that way, so they can't access it until someone models what it is and how it benefits everyone, not just the individual benefiting from it directly in that moment.
Yes. Modeling, again, is key. And that patience, not expecting change to happen overnight. It's not like flipping a switch. And I think of my friend Daryl Davis. I don't know if you've heard of Daryl Davis before, but he is a blues musician by night, I should say, and an activist by day. And he was raised an embassy brat. So he lived in different countries with his family and came back to the States when he was 10. And he was marching with the Scouts in a parade in, I believe, Massachusetts, and carrying the flag. And he's an African American. And he started being hit with debris from the spectators. He had never experienced racism before, didn't even know it existed, didn't know what it was, because he never experienced that in other countries. And it wasn't until the troop leaders pulled him aside and sat him down with his parents and talked about what happened. He posed this question in his head: how can you hate me when you don't even know me? And while that could have caused bitterness and resentment in many of us, right? Instead, he aimed to seek to understand. And through,
he is now.
oh, you know who he is. Okay. And I think he has a beautiful story. He's a brilliant human being. I love having conversations with him, but it wasn't about convincing and converting. It was about understanding. And through that understanding and that patience and befriending people who hated him, he befriended KKK members and white supremacists. And sometimes it took years for them for that to click and say, I get it now. But he didn't press them. He didn't pressure them. It was through modeling that kindness and compassion and understanding that they too reciprocated that understanding and kindness back.
There are tons of different ways of doing this work, and I won't say one is better than the next. I will say for me that this is just the easiest way for me to do it. I don't know if it's because of my background in mental health, so I have to look at just how the mind operates, and what I know for me is just a more appropriate way of doing this work. But there's nothing like being understood.
Right.
I know when I'm in a space and I'm screaming from the rafters and I don't feel heard and understood, I end up leaving resentful. And that's where bitterness starts to come in, and I start having disdain. And I think it's the truth for everyone. We all operate from that kind of I don't feel heard, I don't feel understood, well, screw you kind of vibe.
Yep.
So for me, again, the work is internal first. We have to build that space where we understand ourselves and how our lived experiences shape our lenses and how it contributed to our biases. I tell people all the time, bias and racist, two different things. Bias by itself is not bad. There's so many purposes to bias. Bias keeps us safe. It's how we choose to project the bias. Just like emotions, there is no such thing as a good emotion or a bad emotion. It's emotion and they're neutral.
Yeah.
But how it shows up, how it presents itself, then we have some conversations right there. But if we don't know, if we're not aware of those things, those biases, then, we turn out to be jerks because we end up projecting them in harmful ways. So understanding is, again, I keep coming back to it. The foundation is the emotional intelligence. But the fact of the matter is, and with me building this house, I can say it to be true. When I go and I check out the construction site, I don't care about the foundation. I want to see, okay, now we have wiring in, the plumbing is in, they even put in a bathtub. I like the bathtub.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the fixtures. I'm looking at the outside things. I'm picking out all these cute things. I'm thinking about paint color. At no point in time did I ever question the foundation. And that is just our general human nature. We don't look at what is important first. Because if my foundation is crappy, my house is going to go down the drain in seconds, no matter how beautiful it is.
Wow. We
have to start investing in that foundation first. And when we look at organizations as a whole, the smallest line on any organizational budget, 9 times out of 10, is professional development and capacity building. Again, no one wants to build the foundation. We are so concerned with what people are going to see, what's going to get us headlines, what's going to get us likes, follows, and shares, that we spend very little of our investment on the foundation. We have to fix that. We have to shift it. We have to understand ourselves before we can presume that we can understand someone else.
What a beautiful analogy. That's amazing. And a perfect note, I think, to end on. Since we're at the top of the hour, this has been a insightful, enlightening, exciting, passionate conversation. I have thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you, Crystal, and I hope that those of you listening and watching have as well. I want to say this, that Crystal Morris is a listed EI specialist on Emotional Intelligence Magazine. So if you've enjoyed this conversation and her brilliance, you can find her there and check her out and learn more and book a consultation with her. So I will put the link to that in the description of the show notes for this episode. Thank you so much, Crystal. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you for having me on, Brittany. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Take care.